The Battle of Willow Creek, a tale of land, pride, and retribution. It was a crisp September morning in Willow Creek, a small farming town in central Illinois, where the air smelled of fresh-cut hay and the horizon stretched wide enough to make you feel small. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, sitting on the porch of my farmhouse, when I saw a sleek black Lexus SUV roll over the wooden fence separating my alfalfa field from the county road. It didn't stop or hesitate, just plowed through like the fence was nothing more than a suggestion. Behind it came a parade of cars, Autos, BMWs, a couple of Range Rovers like a suburban invasion force. They parked haphazardly across my field, flattening crops I'd spent months tending. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, maybe a funeral procession gone astray. But then I saw Margaret Hensley, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, striding across my land. She wore a glittering sash that read Mother of the Groom, and a smile so smug it could curdle milk. She waved at me from a distance, like I was some hired hand waiting to direct her guests. In that moment, I knew this wasn't an accident. Margaret had decided my farmy livelihood was her parking lot for her nephew's wedding. I set my mug down, my pulse quickening. I'd dealt with Margaret before. She was the kind of woman who'd send certified letters about your mailbox being half an inch too tall, then smile at you in church like she hadn't just tried to fine you $200. 2 weeks earlier, she'd knocked on my door, all politeness and perfume, to inform me that her nephew's wedding would be held at her McMansion across the road. She needed just a few cars to park on my property for a few hours. I'd said no, plain and simple. She'd countered with her usual HOA spiel about community harmony and neighborly goodwill. I repeated my no, firmer. She'd left with a tight-lipped smile that promised trouble. I should have known she'd pull something like this, but even I didn't expect her to treat my land like it was hers to claim. I stood on the porch, watching as more cars poured in 10, then 20, then 30. A guy in a cheap vest was directing traffic, pointing guests to park right on top of my alfalfa. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked to the fence, my temper simmering. Margaret sauntered over, her heels sinking into the dirt. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, just making use of some space, Tom. No need to fuss." "This isn't empty," I said, pointing at the flattened crops. "And it's not yours." She laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "It's just dirt, Tom. You can grow more." That line-ite's just dirt lit a fuse inside me. I didn't shout or curse. I just nodded, turned, and walked back to the house. Margaret thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that I'd already decided this wasn't her victory lap. It was the opening shot of a war. Inside, I fired up my laptop and pulled up the county event registry. A slot was open for a tractor pull, a regional favorite that had lost its original venue 2 towns over. I'd hosted smaller events before harvest parties. For each fundraiser, so I knew the drill. Within an hour, I had the permit. By noon, I'd printed flyers and dropped them at the feed store, the diner, and the hardware shop. Willow Creek Tractor Pull, they read. Cash prizes, free entry, barbecue on site. The date and time? The same as Margaret's wedding. I wasn't just reclaiming my land. I was about to turn her perfect day into a sideshow. Logistics came next. I called up old friends guys who still had monster tractors from their farming days and roped off safe lanes in the field. I notified the sheriff's office, hired a local announcer named Ray with a voice like a foghorn, and arranged for a food truck to show up. Margaret didn't catch wind of it until 3 days before the event, when a gossip at the beauty salon let it slip. She showed up at my door, face red, demanding I cancel. I told her it was permitted, insured, and posted. She threatened to call the HOA board. I reminded her they had no say over farmland. She stormed off, vowing to ruin me. I just smiled. She'd already lost, and she didn't even know it. The night before, I stood on my porch, staring at the quiet field. Rope lines glimmered in the moonlight, and flags marked the pull lanes. Tomorrow, it would roar to life with diesel engines and cheering crowds. Margaret thought she could roll over me. She was about to learn what happens when you trespass on a farmer's pride. The morning of the event dawned loud and chaotic. Tractors rolled in before sunrise, some on flatbeds, others chugging down the road with American flags flapping. By 8 a.m., a crowd had gathered: locals, farmers, kids with snow cones, and teens with phone cameras. Ray tested the mic with a yeehaw. that echoed across the valley. The smell of grilled pork and diesel filled the air. Across the road, Margaret's wedding tent stood like a fragile dream, all white silk and floral arches. Her guests arrived, only to find their parking spot overrun by tractors and spectators. The tension was electric. Some of Margaret's guests tried parking on my land anyway. Big mistake. A sheriff's deputy, off-duty but still in uniform, strolled over and pointed at the event permit posted on a stake. They argued. He didn't budge. They left. Then came Margaret, marching across the field in heels that sank with every step. She screamed at Ray to stop the announcements. He ignored her, turned up the volume, and welcomed everyone to the Willow Creek Tractor Showdown. The crowd roared with laughter. I leaned against the fence, sipping sweet tea, watching her unravel. The first tractor lined up, a beast with tires taller than me. The crowd counted down, and the engine roared, dragging a weighted sled across the dirt. Cheers erupted. I glanced at Margaret. She stood frozen, face pale, realizing this wasn't a fluke. It was a deliberate, glorious middle finger to her arrogance. And it was just getting started. The second tractor revved up, a green John Deere with a driver in a cowboy hat who waved to the crowd like he was born for this moment. The sled groaned as it was dragged through the dirt, kicking up clouds of dust that drifted toward Margaret's wedding tent. Her guests, dressed in linen suits and pastel dresses, coughed and fanned themselves, their cocktail hour turning into a gritty haze. I stood by the fence, my sweet tea now lukewarm, savoring the chaos unfolding across the road. Margaret's perfect day was crumbling, and I hadn't even raised my voice. Her wedding tent, once a vision of elegance, now looked like a prop in a comedy skit. The white silk was streaked with dust, and a floral arch swayed precariously as a gust of wind carried the scent of burnt rubber from the tractor pole. Margaret was in full meltdown mode, waving her arms like she was directing a sinking ship. She barked orders at guests who looked more confused than compliant. One woman in stilettos clung to a folding chair for balance as she navigated a muddy patch, while a man in a seersucker suit muttered curses as he swatted at the diesel fumes invading the hors d'oeuvres table. Ray, the announcer, was having the time of his life. Between pull rounds, he cracked jokes about fancy folks learning to love the smell of hard work. The crowd ate it up, their laughter drowning out the string quartet Margaret had hired. A food truck had shown up uninvited and parked near the field, selling hot dogs and root beer floats. Two kids set up a lemonade stand right across from Margaret's valet table, which was now abandoned after a cloud of dust from a tractor coated the guest book in grit. I couldn't have planned it better if I'd tried. Margaret stormed toward me, her heels long gone, replaced by mud-caked flats. Her mascara streaked down her face, giving her the look of a raccoon caught in a storm. "You did this on purpose," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the field. "You're ruining everything." I took a slow sip of tea and met her gaze. "No, ma'am. I'm hosting a legal community event on my property. You're welcome to join us." Her jaw dropped, and for a moment, I thought she might combust. Instead, she spun around and pulled out her phone, pacing like a general plotting a counterattack. I knew who she was calling. Leonard Price, the HOA president, a man whose idea of leadership was avoiding conflict at all costs. 10 minutes later, Leonard rolled up in a golf cart, his polo shirt straining against his belly. He took one look at the scene, tractors roaring, crowds cheering, Margaret's wedding tent looking like a war zone, and blinked like he'd just woken up in a different century. He waddled over, wiping sweat from his brow. "Tom, I've been told there's a violation of community peace," he said, his voice barely audible over the engines. I handed him a copy of the county permit and smiled. "Feel free to check it out, Leonard. Stay for a hot dog if you want." He skimmed the permit, grunted, and glanced at Margaret, who was now arguing with a guest about where to move the gift table since the original spot was blocked by a makeshift scoreboard. Leonard leaned in and whispered, "Between you and me, this is the most fun this town's had in years." Then he hopped back in his cart and vanished into the crowd, leaving Margaret to stew. The irony hit its peak when Margaret tried redirecting her guests to park along the neighborhood road. The sheriff's deputy, still lounging by his cruiser, shook his head and cited safety regulations. With no options left, her guests parked half a mile away and hiked in, carrying heels in their hands and shielding their faces with wedding programs to block the flying dirt. Meanwhile, the tractor pull was gaining momentum. Tractors from 3 counties had shown up, some with engines so loud they rattled your bones, others patched together with scrap metal and pride. One had flames painted on the side and a horn that blared Sweet Home Alabama. The crowd voted it their favorite before it even competed. I wove through the crowd, shaking hands and soaking in the energy. This wasn't just about teaching Margaret a lesson anymore. It was a celebration of the land, the people, and the kind of stubborn grit that city folks like her never understood. Over by the wedding tent, a photographer approached Margaret, asking if he should start the portraits. She snapped at him to wait until the noise died down. But the noise didn't die down. It got louder. A tractor backfired, sending a flock of birds scattering and Margaret ducking like she was under fire. The crowd roared with laughter. Then came a moment I hadn't expected. Margaret's nephew, the grim lanky kid named Ethan who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, wandered over to my side of the field. He stood next to me, watching a tractor churn through the dirt, dragging the sled like it was nothing. He let out a low whistle. "This is awesome," he said. "I didn't want a big wedding. Aunt Margaret insisted on all this. I just wanted to fish at the lake with my buddies." I raised an eyebrow. "You're welcome to try a pull if you want." He laughed, shaking his head, but I could see him weighing it, like he was half tempted to ditch the tux and climb into a cab. Margaret spotted him and charged over, her face a mask of fury. She grabbed his arm and yanked him back toward the tent, ranting about optics and family disgrace. Ethan glanced back at me and mouthed, "Sorry." I gave him a thumbs up. Poor kid was caught in her storm, but I had a feeling he'd find his way out. The wedding started to implode. Guests were sweating through their suits. The violinist had given up and was scrolling her phone, and the cake delivery guy called Margaret from the road, refusing to drive through the chaos. I sent a volunteer to guide him through a back trail, but by the time the cake arrived, it was leaning like a drunk at last call. Margaret tried to carry it herself, with another guest holding the top tier. They made it 10 feet before slipping in the mud, sending the cake crashing into the grass. A flower girl burst into tears. Margaret stared at the wreckage, her face a mix of rage and defeat. Meanwhile, the tractor pull hit a new high. Ray announced a surprise exhibition, 2 modified rigs racing head-to-head. The crowd surged forward, abandoning Margaret's tent entirely. Her guests, drawn by the noise and spectacle, drifted over, some cheering, others snapping photos. Even a few kids in dress shirts climbed onto hay bales for a better view. Margaret tried shouting across the field, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of engines and applause. For the first time all day, she looked small. By mid-afternoon, my field had become a festival. A local band set up on a flatbed and started playing Johnny Cash covers. Kids danced barefoot in the dust, and the barbecue smoke curled into the sky. People from neighboring towns showed up, drawn by word of mouth and social media posts. They brought lawn chairs and coolers, turning my land into the heart of something bigger than I'd planned. Margaret's wedding, on the other hand, was a ghost town. Her tent stood empty, save for a few abandoned chairs and a sleeping uncle who hadn't noticed the collapse. The sun climbed higher, baking the field in a golden haze as the tractor pulled and roared on. My alfalfa patch, now a battleground of churned dirt and tire tracks, pulsed with life. The crowd had swelled to hundreds locals, out-of-towners, even a few curious stragglers from Margaret's wedding who'd given up on her sinking ship. A banjo riff from the flatbed stage clashed gloriously with the faint, pitiful strains of Margaret's instrumental playlist, still looping from a speaker in her abandoned tent. The air smelled of smoked brisket, spilled lemonade, and the sharp tang of diesel. This wasn't just a tractor pull anymore. It was a rebellion, a middle finger to entitlement, and I was its unlikely general. Across the road, Margaret's wedding tent sagged like a deflated balloon. Mud streaked its once pristine silk, and one corner pole tilted drunkenly after a guest's kid had yanked a balloon string too hard. A tray of shrimp cocktail lay forgotten under a table, swarmed by ants. Margaret herself was a whirlwind of frayed nerves, snapping at anyone who dared cross her path. Her wedding planner, a frazzled woman in a headset, had vanished into the crowd, muttering about hazard pay. I leaned against a hay bale, watching it all unfold, my sweet tea long gone, but my satisfaction growing by the minute. The groom, Ethan, had slipped away from Margaret's grasp again. I spotted him near the food truck, chatting with two tractor drivers about turbochargers. One of them, a burly guy named Hank, let Ethan climb into the cab of his rig and rev the engine. Ethan's grin lit up the field, brighter than the scoreboard. His bride, Lily, joined him, her white dress smudged, but her face relaxed for the first time all day. They grabbed matching lemonade slushies and sat on a hay bale, watching the competition like they'd stumbled into the honeymoon they wanted. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for them two kids caught in Margaret's overblown vision, now finding joy in the chaos I'd unleashed. Margaret noticed them and charged across the field, her dress shoes swapped for plastic-wrapped slippers that squelched in the mud. She nearly tripped over a cooler, her face a mask of fury. "Ethan," she barked, yanking him up mid-conversation. "This is unacceptable." He didn't argue, but his jaw tightened as she pointed toward the tent, ranting about photos and guest lists. Lily followed, her expression a mix of resignation and quiet defiance. Ethan shook his head and walked off toward the barbecue area, leaving Margaret to scream into the void. The crowd barely noticed, their attention fixed on the next pull. Two of the day's biggest tractors lined up for a head-to-head showdown. One, a matte black beast called Iron Goliath, had smokestacks that could double as cannons. The other, a battered red International Harvester dubbed Sally's Wrath, sported welded armor plates and a hand-painted skull on the hood. The drivers saluted the crowd, revving their engines until the ground shook. Ray hyped the moment like a wrestling announcer, his voice booming over the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, get ready for the clash of the titans." People climbed onto trailers and coolers for a better view, their cheers drowning out everything else. Even the sheriff's deputy, still munching a corn dog, joined in, waving his hat. Margaret, desperate to regain control, made a bold move. She stormed the announcer's booth, climbing the rickety steps in her muddy slippers, and snatched the mic from Ray's hand. The crowd fell silent, stunned. "This unauthorized spectacle is disrupting a legally planned family event," she declared, her voice shrill. "I demand you clear this property immediately." Before she could continue, Ray calmly flipped a switch under the table, cutting her mic. He grabbed a backup and drawled, "Folks, that was our first intermission comedy act. Now let's get back to the real show." The crowd exploded in laughter, some tossing empty soda cans in mock applause. A teenager handed Margaret a tractor pull flyer with the permit printed on the back. She crumpled it and stomped down the steps, her face a shade of red I didn't know existed. The tractors roared into action, Iron Goliath and Sally's Wrath digging into the dirt with a fury that shook the earth. Dust flew, and the crowd chanted as the sleds inched forward. Sally's Wrath took an early lead, but Iron Goliath surged back, its engine screaming. The finish was so close the judges had to confer, finally calling it a tie, the tightest pull of the day. A little girl in pigtails waved a handmade tractor flag, her dad hoisting her onto his shoulders. That moment crystallized it for me. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about community, about people coming together in a way her HOA newsletters could never inspire. Back at the wedding tent, disaster piled on. The cake, after its earlier tumble, was unsalvageable, its frosting smeared across the grass like a crime scene. Margaret tried rallying 3 guests to carry a replacement dessert, a store-bought sheet cake, but they refused, citing muddy shoes and a desire to check out the tractors. She attempted it herself, slipping again and landing on her knees. A flower girl sobbed nearby, and Margaret's sister, fed up, left with her kids, muttering about priorities. The catering team was too busy shooing bees off the buffet to help, leaving Margaret to stew alone. The final blow came when her guests started defecting en masse. It began with curious glances toward the tractor pull, then excuses to take a quick look. Within 20 minutes, the wedding tent was a ghost town, save for Margaret, a wilting centerpiece, and the sleeping uncle, still snoring through it all. Even Ethan and Lily had vanished again, spotted slow dancing near the barbecue to a fiddle tune from the band. Their joy was a quiet rebellion, and I couldn't help but smile. Margaret, seeing them, looked ready to implode. She grabbed her phone, probably calling her lawyer or her therapist, but no one could save her now. Then, the local news crew showed up. A van with a satellite dish pulled into the field, and a reporter with a microphone started filming the tractor pull. They interviewed Hank, who grinned and said, "This is what real folks do for fun." They tried talking to Margaret, but she swatted the mic away, ranting about privacy violations. The sheriff, ever the diplomat, gave a soundbite about community spirit and horsepower, his grin barely hidden. The crew's presence turned the event into something bigger, a story that would spread beyond Willow Creek, maybe even go viral. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the tractor pull hit its peak. The band switched to classic rock, and people danced in the dirt, their faces flushed with sun and laughter. Ray tossed tractor-themed t-shirts into the crowd, and a guy with a smoker trailer handed out the last of his brisket sandwiches. My field looked like a county fair from a bygone era, complete with lanterns strung across the path as dusk settled in. Across the road, Margaret sat alone in her tent, arms crossed, staring daggers at the celebration she couldn't stop. She'd come to conquer my land. I'd turned it into a party the whole county would remember. The golden hour bathed Willow Creek in a warm, dusty glow, transforming my field into a scene straight out of a Heartland postcard. The tractor pull was winding down, but the energy hadn't faded. The crowd, now a mix of sunburned locals and wide-eyed newcomers, swayed to the band's rendition of Sweet Caroline, their voices carrying over the hum of idling engines. Kids chased each other with glow sticks as the sky turned pink, and the scent of grilled corn mingled with the fading diesel fumes. My land, once a quiet alfalfa patch, had become the beating heart of something unforgettably, a community uprising sparked by one woman's arrogance. Across the road, Margaret Hensley's wedding tent stood like a monument to her defeat, its sagging silk and scattered chairs a testament to her unraveling empire. Margaret sat alone in a white folding chair, her once impeccable updo now a tangled mess, her dress stained with mud and defeat. She clutched her phone, muttering into it, but her voice lacked the fire it had earlier. The fight had drained out of her, replaced by a stunned silence that spoke louder than her screams. Her guests had long since abandoned her, drawn to the tractor pull's infectious joy. Even the sleeping uncle had woken up, wandered over, and was now munching a hot dog while chatting with a tractor driver. The only sound from her tent was the faint buzz of a forgotten speaker, looping the same tired instrumental track. The tractor pull's final event was an impromptu tug-of-war between two rigs, a spectacle born from beer-fueled enthusiasm and a crowd too hyped to let the day end. A military green Massey Ferguson faced off against a red Case IH, both tethered by a heavy-duty chain with a bandana tied at the center. The rules were simple. Pull the bandana past the center line, win eternal bragging rights. The crowd formed a roaring circle, standing on coolers and hay bales, chanting as the engines revved. I glanced at Margaret, expecting her to ignore it, but her eyes were locked on the scene, her jaw tight. She knew she was no longer the main event. Then came the spark that set the field ablaze. Someone in the crowd, nobody knows who, shouted, "Tie in the limo." Heads turned to the sleek white stretch limousine parked awkwardly at the road's edge, Margaret's pride and joy for shuttling her VIP guests. The driver, a lanky guy who'd spent the day hiding inside to avoid the chaos, stepped out, shrugging. "Why not?" he said, grinning. The crowd went wild. What started as a joke, posing the limo next to a tractor for photos, turned into something bigger. A few overzealous volunteers rigged a safe but real setup, chaining the limo's rear to a mid-sized John Deere. The driver agreed to play along, as long as nobody scratched the paint. Margaret caught wind of it and sprinted across the field, her plastic-wrapped slippers flapping. "This is insanity," she shrieked, arms flailing. "You'll ruin it. I'll sue." Her voice was hoarse, barely cutting through the crowd's countdown. The John Deere revved, the limo's tires squealed, and with a sudden lurch, the tractor pulled the limo backward a few feet. The crowd erupted, phones flashing from every angle. Margaret dove between the vehicles, yanking at the chain with her bare hands, screaming about insurance and vandalism. The sheriff's deputy, leaning against a cooler, dusted off his hat and strolled over. "Already here, ma'am," he said calmly. "And I don't see any laws being broken." Margaret froze, her eyes darting for support, but her guests were all in the crowd, laughing, filming, some holding paper plates from the hog roast. She locked eyes with me across the field, and for a moment, the mask slipped. She knew I'd won not just the day, but the narrative. Her perfect world had been upstaged by mud, horsepower, and a community that didn't bend to her will. I held her gaze, then turned back to the tug-of-war, letting her stew in her defeat. As the tractors powered down and the crowd began to thin, I walked the field to survey the aftermath. The damage was minimal: a few muddy patches, some trampled clover, a dented cooler left behind. But the air buzzed with something deeper, a shared pride that doesn't come often in a town where HOA rules dictate everything from porch lights to petunias. I paused near Margaret's tent, expecting her to say something, but she didn't look up. She was lost in her world, replaying every moment of her failure. Later that evening, as I locked up the barn, I noticed something glinting near the hay bales where the band had played. It was a small trail camera, one I'd set up weeks ago to monitor coyotes. I'd forgotten it was there, mounted on a post facing the field. Curious, I pulled the footage and sat down at my kitchen table with a beer. What I found made my jaw drop. Around dusk, after the limo tug-of-war, Margaret had crept over to the John Deere and tried to slash its rear tire with a steak knife from her buffet. The camera's red recording light had glowed above her, but she hadn't noticed. I watched the clip 3 times, then saved it to a thumb drive and tucked it in a drawer. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it, but it felt like insurance against whatever she might try next. The next morning, the field was quiet, the grass glistening with dew. A few forgotten lawn chairs dotted the landscape, relics of the chaos. I walked the perimeter, sipping coffee, assessing the cleanup. It wasn't bad, just some tire tracks and wrappers to sweep up, but a nagging feeling lingered. Margaret wasn't the type to slink away quietly. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. I played it, and sure enough, it was her voice dripping with venom. She'd filed a complaint with the HOA, claiming noise violations, property damage, and public indecency. She ended with a threat. "I have photos, witnesses, and I'll make sure your permit is revoked." It was laughable, but it confirmed she was gearing up for round 2. An hour later, Leonard Price showed up on my porch, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. He sat down, uninvited, and sighed. "Margaret's been blowing up the HOA board all night," he said. "Emails, calls, the works. She wants fines, sanctions, you name it." He paused, then chuckled. "But half the board was at your event, Tom. They loved it." One guy posted the tug-of-war on the HOA's Facebook page, called it community unity. Leonard warned me that Margaret might escalate beyond the HOA, maybe even try legal action. I nodded, thanking him for the heads up, but I wasn't worried. I had the permits, the footage, and the town's goodwill. By afternoon, Margaret made her move. A young sheriff's deputy, not the one from the event, knocked on my door. He looked more puzzled than stern, explaining he was following up on a vandalism report. I invited him in, poured him lemonade, and laid out every document: permits, emails, flyers. Then I showed him the trail cam footage. He watched Margaret's tire-slashing attempt, blinked, and laughed. "That's the wildest thing I've seen all month," he said, shaking his head. He took a copy of the clip, said her claims wouldn't likely go anywhere, and left. But the knot in my gut didn't loosen. Margaret was a cornered animal, and those are the most dangerous. That night, I got a call from Ray, still buzzing from the event. "Tom, you're famous," he said. Someone had stitched together a video montage of the tractor pull clips of the pulls, Margaret's mic-snatching meltdown, the limo tug, and the cake collapse. They'd added dramatic music and subtitles, turning it into a viral sensation. It was nearing 1 million views in under a day. Comments poured in, most laughing, some calling me a folk hero, others sharing their own HOA horror stories. A few news outlets wanted interviews, and a podcast pitched a full episode on the Willow Creek wedding crash. I wasn't sure how to feel about the spotlight, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of Margaret's reputation crumbling with every share. The week after the tractor pull felt like the calm after a tornado. My field, scarred but resilient, soaked up the morning dew as I walked its edges, picking up stray wrappers and a lone flip-flop left behind. Willow Creek buzzed with talk of the event. Folks at the diner swapped stories over coffee, and the feed store had pinned my flyer to its bulletin board like a trophy. I was no longer just Tom, the guy with the farm on County Road 12. I was the man who'd turned Margaret Hensley's wedding into a footnote and her arrogance into a punchline. But I knew better than to think she'd vanish quietly. Women like Margaret don't fade, they fester. The viral video had taken on a life of its own, racking up 2 million views by Tuesday. Comments flooded in, some praising my stand, others debating whether I'd gone too far. "This is what happens when HOAs think they own you," one wrote. Another countered, "He ruined a wedding over parking? That's petty." The online chatter didn't bother me much. I'd done what I had told, but it did amplify the stakes. Margaret's humiliation was now public, and that made her dangerous. Wednesday morning, I found a box at my front gate, no return address. Inside was a crumpled wedding invitation and a half-used tube of lipstick, its shade a garish coral that screamed Margaret. It was her version of a warning, or maybe just a tantrum in physical form. I tossed it back in the mailbox and flagged it for the mailman, shaking my head. If she thought cryptic gestures would rattle me, she'd misread me entirely. But it confirmed she was still out there, plotting. I decided to head her off. The next HOA meeting was open to residents, so I showed up uninvited, a folder of documents under my arm. The community center smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy, and the room hushed when I walked in. Margaret sat at the front, arms crossed, her face a mask of barely contained fury. I waited for public comments, then stepped to the mic, my voice steady. I recounted everything: her initial demand, the trespass, the tractor pull, and the permits that made it all legal. Then I plugged my laptop into the projector and played the trail cam footage of her slashing the John Deere's tire. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's face drained of color, her hands gripping the table. I closed with a simple statement. "I don't want trouble. I just want my land respected. But if anyone tries to take what's mine again, I won't just defend it, I'll make sure the whole town gets a front row seat." I sat down, the room buzzing. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Leonard Price cut her off, moving the meeting along. The board didn't need to say much. The footage had done the talking. 2 days later, Leonard stopped by my porch with news. The HOA board had met privately and voted to dissolve Margaret's role as president. Her influence, built on years of bullying and newsletters, was gone. She was still a resident, but her power had evaporated. Leonard handed me a flyer announcing a new HOA initiative, community events to revitalize Willow Creek. They wanted me to host quarterly gatherings, maybe even another tractor pull. I laughed, pointing out their hypocrisy. 2 years ago, they'd fine me for a non-compliant mailbox. "Times change," Leonard said with a shrug. I didn't commit, but I pinned the flyer on my fridge, a reminder of how fast the tables can turn. The real surprise came that afternoon. I was fixing a fence post when a pickup pulled up, and out stepped Ethan and Lily, the newlyweds, dressed in jeans and hiking boots. They carried a wooden box between them, their faces lit with shy smiles. "It's not much," Ethan said, "but it's a thank you." Inside was a hand-carved sign that read, "Pull your weight or stay off the field." I roared with laughter, the kind that shakes your chest. Ethan said he'd made it with a buddy who owned a wood shop. I invited them in for iced tea, and we sat on the porch, swapping stories as the valley hummed with late summer crickets. They told me the wedding had been a pressure cooker, every detail dictated by Margaret's need for control. The tractor pull, chaotic as it was, had been their escape. When we saw everyone laughing and cheering, Lily said, we realized we didn't need her version of perfect. They'd eloped the next day, driving to the Ozarks for a quiet ceremony by a waterfall, no phones, no guests. It was the first time we felt married, Ethan added. He thanked me for giving them clarity, for showing them they could choose their path. I nodded, humbled. Margaret's overreach had backfired in ways she'd never imagined. As they left, Lily turned back. If you ever do another event, I'm running the lemonade stand. Ethan grinned. And I'll drive a tractor. I waved them off, watching their truck disappear down the road. Their happiness was a quiet victory, one Margaret couldn't touch. It made the whole mess, the mud, the noise, the threats worth it. Margaret didn't vanish entirely. Her newsletters stopped, and word spread she'd taken a retreat to Florida, though nobody knew if it was voluntary. But she wasn't done. A week later, a letter appeared taped to my gate, printed in all caps, demanding restitution for emotional distress and property defamation. It cited fake legal codes and included a blurry photo of her muddy tent, with a bill for $5,000 in damages. I filed it in a folder labeled Margaret's Meltdowns and drove to the sheriff's office with the trail cam footage, my permits, and her letters. The deputy, the same young guy from before, reviewed everything with a grin. She's got no case, he said, tapping the footage. But this tire-slashing stunt, that's criminal mischief. We'll handle it. I didn't ask for details, just thanked him and left. The public battle was over. The legal one was in better hands. When I got home, I found an email from Ethan, attaching a photo of him and Lily by the waterfall, smiling like they'd found the world's best secret. "You made this possible," he wrote. I printed it and stuck it on the fridge next to the HOA flyer. The field healed over the next month. I replanted the trampled alfalfa, hauled away the last hay bales, and stored the tractor pull banner in the barn. The land looked like itself again, but it carried a new weight. People waved when they passed my gate now, and the diner crowd bought me coffee, calling me the tractor guy. The viral video hit 5 million views, spawning memes and a Reddit thread titled, "Farmer vs. HOA Karen. The Ultimate Showdown." I didn't do the interviews or the podcast, preferring the quiet of my porch to the noise of fame. One evening, as the sun painted the sky crimson, I sat with a beer, listening to the crickets. Margaret had thought my land was hers to take, that I'd buckle under her demands. She didn't count on the roots that run deep out here, roots of pride, community, and a stubborn refusal to be pushed. Her mistake had turned a quiet field into a legend, a place where people came together to laugh, cheer, and remind each other what matters. I'd defended my land, but I'd done more than that. I'd shown Willow Creek, and maybe the world, that entitlement doesn't win when it meets grit. The final twist came a month later. The sheriff's office called to say Margaret had dropped her complaints after they confronted her with the tire-slashing footage. She'd paid a fine and agreed to community service, quietly moving to a condo in Springfield. Her house across the road went up for sale, a for sale sign swaying in the breeze. I didn't gloat, but I did pour myself a whiskey that night, toasting the field that had fought alongside me. I never hosted another tractor pull. The land deserved its rest, and so did I. But now and then, I'd catch a kid at the feed store wearing one of Ray's t-shirts, or hear a neighbor joke about parking wars. The story lived on, a reminder that one person's arrogance can spark something bigger than they ever imagined. And as I sat on my porch, watching the stars blink over the valley, I knew I'd done more than win a fight. I'd carved out a piece of history, and nobody would ever park on my field again. Thank you for joining me on this wild ride through Willow Creek. This story isn't just about tractors or a feud, it's about standing up to injustice, defending what's yours, and finding strength in community. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced someone like Margaret, who tried to bulldoze their way over you? Do you think I went too far, or was the tractor pull the perfect response? Let's talk about power, pride, and where we draw the line when fighting back. Share your stories and perspectives. I am all ears.